All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us, everybody. I'm Julie Smith. I teach in the School of Communications at Webster University, and I'm joined tonight with Megan Lynch. We're going to talk about all the ways that we can figure out what's real and what's not in our new media environment. Megan?
Well, thank you for having me. I have spoken with Julie a couple of times for our news stories to talk about some of the things we see happening, especially in social media, and how to know how to filter this out. So I was really thrilled when she asked me. She's really the expert on this, but we do a lot of digging ourselves. I've been a reporter and a host at KMOX for over 20 years now. I've been there since 1996 in one capacity or another. Came from a public radio background, actually, before I came to KMOX. So, and I've been very fortunate to be able to do a lot of stories where I get to do some digging and really go in depth. So it's been a real privilege to do that.
So tonight, Megan and I are going to have a discussion about the way the news has changed over the last few years, what it means to have a balanced news diet, and ways that we can figure out how to find the truth in all this noise. So the chat function of the webinar is off, but the questions are open. So we encourage you to ask questions if you'd like to. And tomorrow you'll actually be mailed a list of all of the resources that we are going to talk about tonight. So let's get started. Oops. Okay. So we titled this "You're Being Lied To," and that doesn't necessarily mean that reliable sources are lying to you. What it means is that we are so inundated with information that it's getting harder and harder to figure out what's real and what's not. And we decided to do this during Media Literacy Week. Media Literacy Week started today. And if you're not familiar with media literacy, it's basically a critical thinking skill that helps us consume the 11 to 11 and a half hours a day of electronic mass media. So typically what we encourage students to do in a media literacy classroom is to constantly ask questions. And these are some questions that Megan and I are going to talk about tonight. Who's the sender of the message? What's their motive or intent? What tips or tricks do they use to create the message to get my attention? How could someone else interpret this message differently than me? Who's the intended audience? What information is left out? And my favorite is, who is profiting from this message? But tonight we're going to focus on news literacy and how to validate what you see and hear online. So I want to start by asking you a question, Megan. What are some of the ways that the news environment has changed since you started at KMOX?
Wow, it's incredible to see how it has changed, really. We went from not having a website to having a web presence, and now to that being really an important platform for news. I would say when I first started in news, things were a lot more homogenous. It was like there was a code of how we all operated, an ethical standard, and what was accepted and what was not accepted. And so for us now, it's just been incredible when we add on the social media component to it. The news cycle is just never ending. And, I would say it's hard even for news professionals to keep up with what's going on a daily basis. You almost have to be tuned in 24/7 or you feel like you're going to miss something.
It's almost like trying to take a drink out of a fire hose, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
And when you think about the way that we used to consume news years and years ago, so this is Walter Cronkite, right? He existed in what we call a low choice news environment. So if we wanted news in this time period, right, we had ABC, NBC, and CBS nightly newscasts, we had radio news, and we had newspapers that came on pieces of dead tree and were delivered to our driveways. So we didn't have a lot of choice then. We have a ton of choice now, which comes with its pluses and its minuses, right?
I think so. I mean, there are a lot of pros to it as far as being able to get a variety of perspectives and viewpoints, hear from a number of experts on things. On the con side of it, sometimes it can be too much, and trying to filter through it and know what's really legitimate and put things in perspective. I think that is the hardest thing for people right now, to really put things in perspective of how important is this? Because it's turned into an environment where everything is breaking news, and that's really not the case.
When everything's important, nothing's important, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so I think, for me, I find myself having to take a step back and say, okay, in the grand scheme of things, how really important is this? And, how much does this cut to the core of what we need to know? I kind of miss the days where you could watch the nightly news and then go to bed and not have to worry about it until you saw the paper the next morning,
And I've told my students too that I'm old enough to remember when breaking news actually meant something significant was happening.
Yeah.
Right? When
Exactly.
when they would cut into the network programming, which we were all sitting in front of the television watching live as it happened, which is a whole other conversation, right? So what I think is so interesting now is that it's almost like people's definition of news has changed as the platforms have changed and expanded. And how does that affect your job when you realize that so many people are counting on social media platforms to get information from people who might not necessarily have journalism backgrounds?
And I don't necessarily have a problem with people who might be really great storytellers or really have a good sense of balance or ethics. I think there's some really great people out there doing social media that do it well, that have great perspective. So I don't want to, blanket criticize anyone who doesn't necessarily come from a hardcore journalism background. But unfortunately, I think some of the things we see sometimes, it's people that have a certain perspective and they want you to share their perspective. And so they're willing to bend things or mislead or make things more sensational. And then I think you have the financial component to all of this as well, where things are sponsored and people are trying to get as many clicks as they can and as many likes as they can to show how relevant they are or to show advertisers how relevant they are to their audience. And so I think that can be very dangerous and risky, knowing that there's an advertising component to it that it's tied to.
Well, sure. And I think that's one of the hardest things to teach students is the role that they play in the economic structure of all of this, right? That if we are using an app or a website for free, we're not the customer, we're the product being sold. And the social media platforms, because we tend to congregate with people who think, feel, believe in vote the way that we do, right? We tend to find ourselves in echo chambers or bubbles. And this seems to amplify extreme opinions because those are the ones that get the clicks, right? Our students now are getting so much news from TikTok and Instagram. And what concerns me about that is attention span. If we are now consuming news stories in 5-second increments, like you said, how much perspective and how much context are we getting from those little snippets of information? And it's hard to tell.
I know even for myself, there are times a day I do not have time to click through to a story. And I look at the headline and that's the information that I get. I mean, I'll be perfectly honest, it's not a great way to do it. But sometimes as you are scrolling through a feed, that's kind of how you're culling your news information is, to see what's the most relevant to me right now that I need to look at and not really digging deep into the information.
There's a great quote about news on social media. If it's outrageous, it's contagious. And I love that because it plays into our need to feel like we belong to a group, our need to performatively share. In many cases, we share information because we want to be the first to share it or to show that we know something that other people don't. And I think that that's a really interesting way to look at it, is that we are sharing information, not necessarily to share the story, but to be seen sharing the story. Does that make sense?
Oh, I totally agree. And here's what cracks me up. I will have covered a story all day, and then I'll see a friend and they'll tell me all about the story. Because they want to be the one and sometimes they don't have the details right. I went to the news conference, but they're telling me how it was,
Do you ever want to say, I wrote that?
I just let it go. I'm just like, really? Wow.
And I think that this is all amplified now too, because of the pandemic. We are in our homes constantly. So our internet use is increasing and our news consumption is increasing along with the internet use. And I think that has quite an effect on our perception of the world.
And I think too, a lot of even news outlets, political parties, we've seen a lot more use of infographics. I recently did a story on younger voters where this issue came up of, campaigns and other organizations are using young people to get things out on TikTok and not necessarily Facebook, because younger people are using some of these different platforms. And they're doing a lot of information in infographics so that these young people can take it in very quickly. And, there's very little source citing in that, that you can include in an infographic as well.
There's no complete sentences.
Yeah.
Right. So here's the trick.
Yeah.
We process images 40,000 times faster than we process words. And so if you want to get a point across, especially to a younger person, you do it in an infographic, because we're in a very visual society now instead of a literate society, right? Which makes regular radio news, I think, even more difficult sometimes, doesn't it?
It does. And I think what's hard for people to understand when they listen to what we do is that a lot of times I'm doing 3 or 4 versions of a story. They're maybe 30 to 40 seconds long. In reality, that's maybe a quick 10-second soundbite and maybe 4 or 5 lines of words. I've got to encapsulate some pretty big ideas sometimes and get some balance and perspective in a story, and facts. It's got to be facts. Get all that in 40 seconds. And I think, historically, for some people, they love that, bang, 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 bang. That's how we've operated. But I think for some listeners, sometimes they feel like there's a lot lacking because of how we have to get news out there. Now, fortunately, I work at an outlet that does give me a lot of leeway to do long form stories. And so that's been wonderful to have that, but that's not always the case in broadcasting.
You telling that story reminds me of that quote from Winston Churchill when he said, "I would have written a shorter letter, but I didn't have time." Right? Which represents the importance of editing and being concise, which is what you have to do. So I want to bring up something that usually happens when I am doing a workshop about news literacy or media literacy. People invariably complain about bias, and they will say, well, the news is all biased, it's all right wing or it's all left wing. And I wondered, with you as a journalist and me as an educator, how do we respond to those criticisms about the news being biased?
I think we need to own it in some cases. Absolutely. There was a great book that was published. It's probably been about 2 decades ago, and it was all about bias. And at the time, it was a little bit hard to stomach, but it basically said, hey, we all have our own innate biases from how we are brought up and the things that we have experienced. And so, yes, to some extent, journalists are going to bring that into their jobs. I think there's some organizations that do have a certain character and atmosphere. I think for a lot of us older journalists, I'm going to tell you, a lot of us, we don't even vote in primaries so that we don't have to declare a party at the polls. I mean, that's the way we were taught. A lot of things like you just do not have an opinion about, because you've got to be able to present both sides equally, or more than 2 sides.
Or more than 2 sides, right?
Yeah.
Right.
But yeah, when people say that some news organizations have a bent, yeah, I mean, and I think what confuses people even more is, for instance, I work for a news talk station. We have our news product, and then we also have our talk product. And our talk show hosts do have a perspective and an opinion that they bring into it. We are very much separate. They have a programming office. We have a news office. We have a newsroom. But I think in a lot of people's minds, we're one and the same. And that can be very hard sometimes, but I mean, that's just the nature of the business. And so I think our listeners, I would hope, are savvy enough to pick up on that. And I always encourage people, get your news from multiple sources. Don't just watch Fox News. Don't just watch CNN. Don't just watch CBS or listen to CBS. Get your information from a lot of different sources. It's very interesting sometimes to see how different reporters cover the exact same news conference.
Right. We do a lot of that in class, where we will analyze how different outlets cover the exact same story. And the way I try to explain it to the students, when people complain about bias, my response, and maybe this is really off balance, but my response is always, who says we're entitled to objectivity? Where are we entitled to this? Because news is a business operation, right? So if I run a cable news channel and I have data that 90% of my viewers are dog people and don't like cats, then I am going to run stories that are very, very pro-dog and anti-cat, because I want to keep my viewers from changing the channel. I'm going to give them what they want. I will never believe that cable news changes anybody's mind. I think those channels reinforce what their viewers go there for, which is that affirmation, right? The confirmation bias, that what you feel is the right answer.
Yeah.
There's really interesting documentary out on Netflix right now. It's called The Social Dilemma, and there are parts of it that I think are silly, but there are also descriptions of the algorithms that these websites and social media platforms use, and the way that the algorithms can actually polarize us even further, because we train these sites. You know, if I'm on Twitter or Facebook and I continually like sites about dogs, I am training them that I like dogs. So I'm going to get more stuff about dogs, and I'm going to get messages about how cats are bad, right? So because of that, then I never see a message about how cats are good. And so that just seems foreign to me. Like, why would anybody like a cat? Cats don't even exist in my world, right? So it's interesting. There's a phrase, there's two different types of polarization. There's called affective polarization, which is how much the other sides hate each other. And then there is ideological polarization, which is how much the sides disagree on certain topics. And what's interesting is that ideological polarization has not changed. The sides don't disagree any more than they used to, but that affective polarization has increased hugely, where the sides now really, really dislike each other. And I think that that's so problematic when we want to have a real civil discourse about what's going on. And I'm sure you find that with anytime KMOX has a call-in show, right? People who are mellow never call, right?
Yeah, and I think that's part of putting it all in perspective is, and especially in social media, you know, you'll notice people that they comment all the time about everything. There are some people that they are super engaged, but then you go to the grocery store and run into people you know, and it doesn't seem like anybody is that dramatic in their opinions. And so I think it's really valuable to make sure that you're getting a variety of opinions on stuff, because I think for the most part, people that hold really strong opinions, yes, they are going to be the most outspoken and get their message out there the most. You know, one other thing I would say about the mainstream news outlets at this point, and this is something that I have just seen maybe in the last month or two, but if you look at websites, and this is a little bit concerning to me, I have noticed like a headline that will grab my attention, and then in the lower corner, I'll see it say analysis. So it's not a news story. Yes, this is opinion. Basically, you can call it what you want, but it's basically opinion. And so I would just alert people to that as you are looking at some websites. Be mindful of that it's not necessarily a news story. It's more of a column.
So as a journalist, as someone who's been doing this for a while, what recommendation would you give someone? I mean, it seems easy enough, but I think it's getting harder and harder. How do you tell the difference between a news story and an opinion or talking head or analysis or a column?
It's getting very hard. Yeah, it's getting very hard. And I find it to be very frustrating. And I don't blame people for being frustrated and just going to one source that they love, because it gets so hard to sift through it all. I was talking this morning, we were talking on KMOX this afternoon about what we're going to be doing tonight. And I was saying one of my pet peeves are these organizations or even very wealthy individuals that have these websites, and they look very much like a legitimate news story, but they are not. And one in particular, and I'll just call it out, it's called Prairie State Wire. This individual has these news websites all across the state of Illinois. But when you read these stories, you'll find that they have a lot of gaps and they leave out a lot of information, but they have very tantalizing headlines. that draw you in. And I see people share them on Facebook all the time. And so for me, it starts with asking some of those easy critical questions. Who, what, why, where, when, how. Have those questions been answered for me in this story? Is it in context? Has it been, put in the context that the comment came from? And I'm going to say, for people who are viewing right now, you are at a time in history where you actually have some of the same access to the newsmakers that we do via these same platforms, Facebook and Twitter and Vine, where people are posting videos of their news conferences, and you can go in and watch from start to finish. I know it's time consuming, but if you really want to know the truth for yourself, it's kind of like C-SPAN used to be. Take the time to go watch it, especially on important issues like the public health crisis that we're in right now.
Do you know what's so interesting is that I've had people say, okay, Julie, I see someone sharing fake information on Facebook. What do I do? Should I call them out? And I always say, yes, yes, it's all of our responsibilities. But you want to do that in a gentle way, right? You don't want to shame anybody publicly. Typically, you want to be really gentle and maybe do it in a direct message. But what's so interesting is that the research says that when people are confronted with facts that disprove their belief, instead of saying, oh, I didn't know that, they tend to dig in.
Yeah, they double down.
They double down. And so it's almost self-defeating to bring it up that they've shared false information. So what do you do? What advice do you give people when there's a good chance that sharer is going to double down?
One of the techniques that you actually shared with me was to go to someone privately. Don't do it in a Facebook post, but to go to them privately by message, and I've done this to talk to people and to say, hey, do you know where this article actually came from? In one case, it was a friend that shared something, and it was from a really crazy religious cult that has a quote unquote news site. And I knew that it was completely contrary to what this person's core beliefs were. And their comment to me was, well, I still believe that what's in there is true. And I said, yes, but do you really want to be associated with that? This is what you've put out there to other people, right, and you're sharing it.
And Facebook now knows that they've shared it and has kept track of that, right?
Yeah. And the article was not factual, and it was not balanced, and it was put there for an emotional response.
But it looked like news, right?
Yeah,
it looked like news.
Very much like news. I had to do a lot of digging to figure out where it came from. And eventually, because I had a relationship with this person, mm-hmm, I was able to say, listen, I'm not attacking you. I'm trying to help you protect your reputation.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
So we're in the reputation protecting business. Is that what we're calling it? That's what we'll call it. So this morning, I had 2 classes this morning, and I thought that I would get the perspective of 20-year-olds, right? Like, how do they know that a source is legitimate? And they came up with some really interesting comments that I wanted to share with everybody. They said, always look for the source. Who is the publisher? If there is a link, a valid link. One of my students said, don't ever click on a link that's sent by an email that sounds urgent because that's going to be horrible phishing. They all commented on how if a news report seems too vague or uses a clickbait headline. So we started talking like, how do you identify a clickbait headline? And one of the things I mentioned was that you will never see KMOX tweet something that says, please share this because the media will not tell you, right?
Yeah, I love that one. Yeah.
Typically, you're going to see breaking in all capital letters. You're going to see a lot of exclamation points. You're going to see listicles like 10 things to worry about the election. You won't believe number 7, right? Anything to try to get you to click. And then that leads to the discussion about how these websites make money based on the web traffic and how we play right into that. But you brought up something so interesting, and I think it's 100% on target. If we have a really strong emotional response to something that we see online, that is the first clue that we need to check it for authenticity. If it makes us really excited about a candidate we love, or really angry about a candidate we hate, or if it makes us really confused or sad or emotion in any range, that's the sign that we need to check it, because typically reliable news sources are going to be calm, even if the story isn't calm, right?
Absolutely. And you'll notice the tone of some of these articles are even close to being irate, very frenzied and have a certain pitch and anger to them, in a lot of these, and outrage and things like that, and just things that we don't put in a news story. We just don't.
Right.
We completely take the emotion out of it. I mean, we're the people that can tell you about a tornado headed your way and be perfectly calm, because that's what we're trained to do.
Because that's what you're supposed to do. Yeah. Here's another thing that I think is a challenge. Oh, we have some questions. Let's see. What are my thoughts about Donald Trump's version of things? Brenda, I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole. And Wiley says let's see, she listens to NPR, best friend listens to another station, accessibility. Oh, that's true. And I think that accessibility plays a role. And I think that what we're exposed to when we're growing up plays a role, right? And here's something else that plays a role. I'm going to show another visual that I think is so fun, because we do this in my class. We like to create images that look real, but aren't. There are so many websites where you can create false images that look absolutely legitimate, that they look like they come from a verified Twitter account or a verified Facebook page. You can falsify text messages. You can create something that looks like it's from breaking news CNN. Because of that, I think that younger people are actually better at spotting false information than older people, because the younger people are more aware of all of these tools and they've been creating stuff for screens their whole lives, whereas people our age grew up when very few people had access to screens, right? So exactly. This I think is one of the biggest challenges, because anybody can create anything that looks legitimate.
Well, and even one of the things that I've started doing with some of these is searching for the reporter to see if you can find the reporter that's listed. And a lot of times what you'll end up with kind of you'll go in a circle trying to figure out who this person is. And they may be called like a freelance journalist. And you kind of keep getting back to the same sources, or they're one of those lists of, 400 top journalists. Well, guess what? People pay to get put in those books, So, and you don't really ever find their articles in any really legitimate news source. But again, that takes a ton of digging, but it's worth it sometimes if you're suspicious about an article.
Right. So what are some things that make you suspicious about an article? Besides, we talked about the image that could easily be doctored. We talked about the strong emotional response. Is there anything else that kind of gives you a clue that maybe you need to check it out?
If it's information that I have not heard before, I feel like I'm pretty tuned in, but if this is something that I haven't heard before, or it's being presented in a way that seems somewhat unusual, and I wish I could be more specific about that, but and I think it's getting harder and harder, because the world we live in right now is pretty crazy. So well, sometimes
it's hard to tell reality from the onion.
Yeah, exactly. The parody accounts are growing legs right now, because the world is so turned upside down that some of their headlines are actually pretty believable. Yeah. I think that's pretty scary at this point. But yeah, I think it's just being well-rounded and kind of having a good sense of how certain things work help you to figure out if something seems a little suspicious.
Yeah, I had students say they look for flashy titles. flashy photos that are probably recycled or repurposed. I also had a student say that they need to have a BS detector activated at all times, which I liked that, and that they need to be their own detectives. But Carol brought up something interesting on Panel X today. What if you don't want to be a detective? What if you are very comfortable consuming your little news bubble? What do you do then?
I don't know that there's much that we can do. And there's always been that old argument in news. I mean, I've had so many calls over the years of people saying, why are you allowing them to express their views? Why did you have that viewpoint on? Yes, I mean, literally, I've had those conversations with people. It used to be, I'll give an example, Planned Parenthood. Why did you allow that woman from Planned Parenthood to be on? Do you agree with what she says? It's like, it doesn't matter if I agree with what she says or not. That's not my job, but it's not unhealthy for you to hear a different perspective. Would you rather be ignorant of what's going on, or would you rather know what's going on so that you can craft your arguments against it?
Do you really want the answer to that question?
But it's kind of an age-old thing of, people say they want balance, but sometimes I don't really think they do.
No. And I have read that news stations, have data on what stories get clicked on their social media feeds, and that everyone says, I want good news. I want good news. Why don't you ever say any good news? But the top 20 clicked stories every day are about violence and murder. So even when you give good news, our human nature sometimes, I guess, betrays us, right?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's very interesting for me to see what friends post on Facebook. What stories from all the local news outlets they put on. Inevitably, it's the big car wrecks that affected their commute to work, or it's some gory, gruesome crime story. But yet, on the same hand, people will say, I'm tired of these kind of stories, but yet that's what people end up talking about.
Do you feel like that because there's so many options for news now, that the definition of newsworthiness has actually changed?
I'd say my definition of it is still the same.
Okay.
When it comes to putting a story together or even crafting a newscast, I would say I always go with what affects the most people. That's always the first story you're going to run. What's the biggest story that affects the most people? And then you kind of go from there in importance. I don't know that everybody necessarily does that, but for me, like traditionally, that's still how I play it. Or you go with the breaking news story first, like the newest, freshest information, and then you go down from there. But newsworthiness, I guess you just get a sense, like your antenna go up if it's a news story.
Says the news person. Right? So I had something happen in April that I thought was really interesting. This was posted on Facebook that Queen Elizabeth had tested positive for the coronavirus. So if you notice, by the time I got this, so this was the end of March, it had already been shared 18 times. And it was proven false by Snopes. But here's the clue, and here's what you want to look for, at least from a media literacy, social media point of view. If you see something that certainly sounds like a news story, like this would be a story, right, Megan?
Mm-hmm.
It'd be a big story. If somebody on Facebook is the only one talking about it, then that's the red flag. So a lot of my students actually mentioned this, which made me very proud. They said that they always look for other sources talking about the same story. And the word we use for that in my world is called lateral reading. So if you see something on Facebook, or if you see something on TikTok or Twitter, and there's only one person talking about it, that's the red flag, right? So you want to check and see, are other people talking about this? Because on this particular day, if I had gone to KMOX.com or CNN.com or MSNBC.com and they were all talking about the Queen, then I would know that it was true. But we have to make sure that we do that lateral reading and check with as many sources as possible before we assume that something is legitimate, because it's so easy to create misleading information.
There was a rumor this morning about a story related to the campaign and the Biden family, but it was only coming from a couple of sources. It was not confirmed. You could not find it anywhere else. And that was a red flag that, guess what? We're not going to talk about it until someone does some checking and either confirms it or does not confirm it.
And one of the websites that we're going to share with you all is a site where you can enter in a URL of a website and it'll tell you who's paying for that website. And that'll give you a clue, in many cases, what their point of view is. And you know what I think is so interesting is that I have entered extreme right-wing websites and extreme left-wing websites into that search engine, and it turns out they're owned by the same company. which demonstrates the economic aspect of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely. So I would say lateral reading is super important. There's other things. Okay, so here's the $1 million question, Megan. We assume you get your news from KMOX because you're there, but what other sources do you trust?
I read a lot of different sources, and I don't know if trust would be the word.
Trust might be too strong.
Yeah, but I
do you value what sources do you value?
I value the main media outlets. And I would say, CBS, obviously, because frankly, we know a lot of those correspondents from years of interacting with them on the air.
World News Roundup.
Yeah, exactly. We know the standards that have been in place in that organization, and kind of the like-minded ethics that we have. Now, are they infallible? No. None of us are. We're human. But Wall Street Journal, New York Times. Some of the names probably will send people through the roof because they've got different opinions about that. But I look at them all. I try to look at as many sources as I possibly can. I always have a browser up on Fox News, CNN, and USA Today. On the computer,
covering the spectrum.
It is so fascinating. It's so fascinating to see, who is leading with what.
There is a really interesting website called All Sides, and it will list stories, how they are presented by MSNBC, how they're presented by CNN, and how they're presented by Fox. And it's so interesting because I'll show these varieties, right, to my students, and I'll say, which one is wrong? Well, none of them are wrong, right? They're all just presenting the story in different ways, which I think is a good exercise for people to realize.
Even as a local reporter, there have been times I have gone to a news conference with 10 other reporters, and then you look at their stories, you watch their stories, or you read it, and we've all got basically the same information, but some of them have keyed in on different points, maybe based on past stories that they've covered, or they did an interview after the news conference with someone to get a little extra information. And so, it's always interesting. Some of my colleagues in the area of, sometimes I'll do the same story and I'll read, man, they really have a way of writing that really brought that story out a lot better than I did. But all the same information is there.
Right, right. So we had a couple questions. One was, has the term fake news affected the media literacy world, which of course it has. And I imagine that term has affected the journalism world as well, right, Megan?
Oh, it's I don't even know how to respond to that. A lot of this started with Rush Limbaugh calling us all the drive-by media. And
what? misinformation, and we have to specify the difference between misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation is accidental mistakes made by humans, because we are all humans. Disinformation is information that is deliberately incorrect in order to have a certain effect. Sorry, Megan, go ahead.
No, I think that's great. And, I guess for me, I feel like, where did this come from? I think for a lot of journalists, it's been like, wow, what is this tidal wave that has hit us? And, we used to be called the fourth estate. We were trusted. We were the watchdogs. And a lot of us took that very seriously. It wasn't a right. It's a privilege, and it's a service. I mean, what we do is a service. But I know there are some personalities in the business that are not necessarily as news oriented.
Right.
They have a different perspective. And so I think that's what has blurred the lines for a lot of us. But fake news, I don't think it tells us anything anymore. It doesn't,
No.
that term doesn't.
Well, it's lost.
Tell us a thing.
Whatever punch it had, it's gone. Right. And at least from a media literacy point of view, when we talk about the history of news, misinformation and disinformation has been around forever.
Propaganda.
Sure. And Julius Caesar used it, Genghis Khan used it. But the difference now is that it travels at the speed of light. It travels much faster than the truth. But I agree with you that the term, in many cases, I think people use it just to describe information that they don't like.
Yeah.
To take away any credibility that information might have.
I think it's really sad when someone dismisses someone else's work out of hand without looking at kind of the entirety of their body of work. Mm-hmm. I know good journalists who go in and do their job with integrity day in and day out. And it's hurtful. They want to provide a service and they're dismissed out of hand just because someone doesn't agree maybe and with the story that they've written.
Yeah, sometimes seen as the enemy, which is dangerous. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I get asked a question frequently: why do people do this? Why do people do this? And usually I tend, to quote that Batman movie. Some people just want to watch the world burn, right? Some people like to just stir things up. But I think that we don't look at the whole story if we only talk about the sport of fooling the other side as much as we need to talk about the economics of it and how those clicks can make teenagers in Macedonia $60,000 a month. And we have to be aware of that. So I think there's a wide range of why people share false information, but I think in many cases, it's a financial reason. There was also a question, and I'm not sure that I really know the answer to this, so Megan, I might defer to you. How come stations air political ads that contain false information?
I would have to go back to some of my mass communication classes, but basically they're allowed to. It's free speech. I'm sure some media law professors could handle this a lot better than I could. But basically it's, and we're supposed to provide a service. The airwaves are public. The FCC governs that. And so, we don't exercise any editorial control over those.
And stations can make a lot of money based on those. From one point of view is that a station can profit quite a bit from local political ads. But once you quote unquote thrust yourself into the public sphere, I believe is the quote, you no longer have the threshold of privacy or the libel threshold of a regular citizen like us. Mm-hmm. So Megan and I would have a libel case against someone if they published a commercial that was full of false information about us and it damaged our reputation. But if we were running for office, we give up that ability and everything is fair game, which is why those media literacy skills are even more important, right? When it comes
Well,
to political commercials.
and what you find with those political ads is usually there's a little bit of a nugget of truth to them. And then they have been either blown out of proportion or spun in a certain way. Certain information has been taken out of context or omitted to make it look a certain way.
Sure. And there's lots of interesting websites too. If this is up your alley, you can analyze the formula of a standard political commercial and see lots of varieties. There's also a really interesting website called Living Room Candidate, and it includes every television commercial from every presidential campaign that has happened since television advertising started, which is really interesting to see how ads use images so effectively and voiceover. But I'm nerdy. I love that. I love that stuff. Okay, so let's go into some nitty gritty details as we wind up here. Other things to look for. Now, this is a new follower that I had on Instagram. Even though I am middle-aged, he slid into my DMs and wanted me to be his girlfriend. Now, what are our clues? Typically, accounts that originate from other countries do not capitalize correctly, have trouble with our verb infinitives, and also have trouble with our articles like a and the. Okay. There were red flags all over the place here with my new boyfriend, Austin, because he didn't capitalize. He describes the Army as USA Army, and he loves to gym. So what's interesting, and if you are on TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook for that matter, in many cases, bot accounts that are run by algorithms will present themselves as military because they know that we have a deep, abiding love and respect for our military, and we're more likely to respond to someone who presents themselves as military. So you want to look for military images and capitalization problems, verb infinitive problems. And really, like my oldest son said, if this was really his abs, he would have more than 3 posts. There's another thing that to look out for, and this is on Facebook, and this is a relatively new service that Facebook is providing. It's called the page transparency. So if you like a page, Americans for Dogs, when you go to that page, there's going to be a section called page transparency, and it will tell you when the page was created and where it actually originated from. So in many cases, like last year, Facebook culled a bunch of their pages that were actually originating in the Ukraine. So this is a way that Facebook is attempting to say, look, we're trying to keep an eye on all of this. So you want to look for where the page originated and when it was created. And that's the same with Twitter and Instagram accounts also. If they're brand new accounts, that is also a red flag. And if there's a Facebook page that's only a couple months old, that is also a red flag. What are some clues that you look for on Facebook, Megan?
For me, Facebook, I would say it's the same thing. And I love this tool at looking at page transparency. I have never seen this before. So I look forward to using that. But yeah, it's the same thing. It's the length of time. It's the friends. I look at the about page, things like that, just to see if there's a link to a good website or not.
Or a real website, a website in English.
And that's one of the luxuries that I have. I can search those things on my work laptop instead of my personal laptop, which I think sometimes is a little risky. Be careful what you click through too. If you're using your home computer, for me, I can say, well, it's part of doing my research for my job. But that's what I look for too. Profile pics that look too good to be true. Maybe only 1 or 2 photos listed in their profile is usually a pretty good clue.
Or a hot green beret with no shirt, red flag.
Yeah.
Yeah, red flag. So we've got some questions. Teresa wants to know, how can she trust what is being presented as fact? She is leery of trusting anything. I say, good on you, Teresa. Keep being skeptical. In my view is that you want to be skeptical up to the point of being cynical. You don't want to be cynical, but you do want to be skeptical. What advice do you have for Teresa, Megan?
I don't blame her one bit. And I would hope we would have more people like that in a way. And, it used to be the days when we would get a call from someone in a newsroom who would listen to our story and they would say, listen, you didn't mention this, or you didn't go into this issue, or did you know there was a related issue? Really intelligent questions.
Uh-huh.
A lot of times now we just get, I don't agree with what you put out there. I don't agree with the viewpoint of that person you put on the air. And so I love, Teresa, that you want to be critical of it. And I would say, it just comes down to, let's say maybe you hear of a survey or a poll. Try to find the original source of that if you're skeptical, and really see, because a lot of times they are published, you can find them pretty easily, and really see how many people were sampled. Was it a good sample size? Who was it that was sampled?
Was it landline or cell phones? Because that'll tell you exactly what age they are, and how the questions were worded. That's a big one too.
Exactly. Yes. What questions were asked, and then make sure they did their math correctly. Some of these studies are very, there's a lot of ways you can make statistics do what you want them to do.
Right. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, there was an article in The Guardian from the UK about how 60% of American millennials didn't know that 6 million Jews died in the Holocaust. And so we went through that article in class, and the headline was very, very misleading. Very misleading. Yeah. Kate wants to know, how would we advise people to consume news from other sources? Kate, that's a toughie, but I would say, gosh, if you go up to the buffet at a fabulous restaurant, don't you want to try more than one thing? Right? What would you say, Megan?
Absolutely. And, I don't feel like it's too hard with our busy daily lives to, go to 6 different news sources every single day. But, just keep maybe a bigger variety on your browser, or, follow more variety on Twitter or Facebook or whatever platform you use the most. And, take some time to read that NPR article or listen to that report that they did. Spend some time looking at your local TV stations and your local newspaper and reading through some of those columns and in-depth reports that they've done, as you can do it. And I think it'll give you just a broader sense of what's going on overall.
If you can sell somebody on that idea, right? That's the hard part.
Yeah.
The sales job. So Beth wants to know what our thoughts are on social media responsibility to fact check information. I have strong opinions about this. Imagine that. I do not trust Mark Zuckerberg. I don't, and I don't trust the government to tell us what's true and what's not. And so it is up to us. I feel like it is our responsibility to figure out what is real and what is not. Now, the platforms themselves are only platforms. As of right now, they are not legally liable for anything that is posted on their platforms. But I think they see regulation coming down the pike, and they're trying to backtrack as much as possible. What do you think, Megan?
I think it just breeds more suspicion. Yeah. I think that by doing that, and I've heard enough instances of people saying that truly innocuous material has been blocked just because somehow the algorithm, raised a red flag. Right. I think that to tell us this is really an imperfect technology that they're trying to employ. And unfortunately, I think it just makes people feel like they're being censored.
Yeah, I can see that. Cheryl says, what is some disinformation we're likely to be confronted with? And I actually read an article about this morning. The stories that we will probably see next week, anything about polling places being closed, polling place hours changing, polling places being moved, ballot boxes being moved, the lines being too long. What we need to do is recognize that most polling places are going to be fine, and that social media is going to amplify the extremes on all sides. next week, I would almost recommend, I mean, I think I might just stay off social media altogether next week. I don't know how anything good can come of it. Is that too pessimistic, Megan?
I guess I would say just be very careful. And here's the thing that, you know, as someone that goes into the field, or at least used to more, you know, and observe different settings, what troubles me a lot about things that are posted by just citizens or individuals is a lot of times when you're seeing video, you're seeing 20, 30 seconds of it. A lot of times you don't see what happened before or after. You're not getting a very wide perspective like you would if you were there witnessing it yourself and seeing the whole dynamic. It's two-dimensional, you know, it's not three-dimensional.
Right.
And, you know, the limit on the words and not knowing maybe what someone's perspective is or what their agenda is. Yeah, I think everything next week, you know, I say do what journalists do, verify something with at least 3 sources before you buy into it lock, stock, and barrel.
Now, Maria asked what sources we would recommend. So this is how Megan and I are going to end our evening with you tonight. This is a list of sites that we use in our own work. So there's sites for analyzing photos, sites for analyzing videos, for analyzing websites, analyzing social media platforms to find out if your new Twitter boyfriend might be a bot. There's also sites for regular fact checking. There's also sites where you can analyze the ads that appear on your social media platforms based on what you've told them. And then there's some general resources that Megan and I really like. There's a verification handbook that is free, includes loads and loads of tools. First Draft News and News Literacy Project are 2 organizations that function strictly in news literacy and sharing resources, especially when it comes to COVID-19 misinformation and election misinformation. So this is what you will receive, a link. This document with all these links is what you will receive in your inbox tomorrow as a thank you for joining us tonight. Megan, any closing words?
You know, I would like to just say real quickly, I mean, it gives me a lot of hope that we've had so many people join us tonight, number one. I think just the thought of starting to think critically is wonderful. And my advice would be, before you forward something or share it or like it, think twice. I think that is the start to any of this. Just think twice. And it's okay to sit and ponder something for 24 hours before you share it. You don't have to be first to get it out.
Yeah, but by 24 hours, the story's already moved on to something else.
And completely changed. Yes. So, but I applaud everyone. I think this is a great start.
And we are so grateful that so many people chose to spend this dreary evening with us. Thank you so much. And on behalf of the School of Communications and the Media Studies program, which has just been revamped, and I'm super excited about it. So if you know anyone looking to come to college, please encourage them to come to Webster and take a tour. And if you have any further questions, once you receive this link, this document tomorrow, please let us know. But thank you so much for joining us tonight.